I've got a whole copy of
The
it.
same thing, I just changed it up.
You're ready to roll. No, I'm not. I've got to go dig stuff out.
That's me.
I got to get ready to go.
Hey, have you brought up the illustration about the guy that got swallowed here?
Not yet. It's a lawsuit. Yeah. And they said they don't do no accident either.
Well, so what I read was that because of the way it seemed, it didn't sink. According to our Bible, it got him. And as soon as he recognized it started convulsing and spitting out. So his friend on the boat said, they come out of the water feet first. That's how much pressure.
Wow. Spewed.
Yeah, well, you know how normally you got somebody in the boat watching where the boat goes?
Yeah.
That guy saw him come out of the water.
That squeaky, you're getting more distinguished. It catches up with us all. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I let my hair grow out a little. And I got it short once I realized how much gray was showing.
Well, good morning, and welcome to Maranatha Baptist Church for Sunday school this morning. Go ahead and turn to Jonah, chapter 1. That's where we're going to start out today. So we're continuing our series on Jonah, studying through that book and his life, or this part of his life. And this is a little bit of slow going. We're only going to be looking at, still in chapter 1, going to be looking at verses 4 through 10. But before we do that, we're going to open up in a word of prayer. Any prayer requests we'll start out with on this side, if there's any prayer requests. Yes, sir.
Susan's doing her back.
Okay. We're praying for Miss Susan. Yeah. Yes, sister.
My mom, her
Yeah. So praying for Miss Carolyn's parents. Others? In the middle here, prayer requests? Yes, sir. Okay. So we're praying for Sarah Camp. Yeah. Sister. Okay. Yeah, keep praying for Kayla. Yeah. All right, anybody on this side? Yes, sister.
Our nephew Cheyenne is his name. He was in a.
Okay.
Our nephew Cheyenne is his name.
So, Sister Ula's nephew, be praying for them. Okay. All right, anybody on this side? Yes, sister.
Our nephew Cheyenne is his name.
So, Sister Ula's nephew, be praying for them. All right, anybody on this side? Yes, sister. Okay. So, Sister Ula's nephew, be praying for them. All right, well, let's open up in a word of prayer. Oh, sorry. The others? All right, let's open up in a word of prayer. We'll get started. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time together. We thank you for your mercy and your love for us, Lord, that you allow us to come before you, even though we don't deserve it, Lord. And just thank you for your grace in our lives. And just pray just help with these prayer requests, Lord, that your hand may be upon those that are sick and ill or those that need help, Lord, and comforting. I just pray just help us to be an encouragement to them, that your will be done in all those situations. And that I just pray that you just work in our lives, Lord. Help our lives be an example for you in whatever situation we find ourselves in, Lord. I just thank you for the reminder that you've given me out of this lesson today, Lord. Just help us to be focused on you no matter what storm we face. And just thank you for your goodness and thank you for the time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, Jonah chapter 1. So we know that Jonah, in verse 1, got a word of the Lord, came into Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." So God has sent Jonah on a mission, and that mission was to go to Nineveh. We talked quite a bit in the first couple lessons about Nineveh and what it was and the kind of place it was, and Jonah's hesitation to go to Nineveh. And it wasn't just he was nervous or he decided, it's not really kind of the top of my list. What did he decide? I'm going to go the exact opposite direction. I'm going to go as far away from where God wants me to be because that's not what I want to do. And we see in verse 3, but Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And remember, Tarshish is in Spain, so the other side of the Mediterranean. So he's going in the exact opposite direction from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, and he paid the fare thereof, and went down to it to go unto them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. His goal was to go from the presence of the Lord. And it always amazes me that Jonah thought he could go from the presence of the Lord. As a prophet, as someone that had prophesied before in some time, and he would even think that he could go from the presence of the Lord. But we see here, we looked at last time the Jonah's response. We looked at the call that he was given. We looked at Jonah's response to that call, and now we're going to look at that rebuke, the response of God to Jonah's disobedience. And read down in verse 4, it says, "But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. And the mariners were afraid and cried every man unto his God, and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it off of them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay, and he was fast asleep. So the shipmaster came to him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us, that we perish not. And they said, every one to his fellow, Come, let us cast lots, and we know for whose cause this evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lots fell upon Jonah. And they said unto him, Tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us. What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? What is thy country, and what people art thou? And he said unto them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of Israel, or the God of heaven, that made the sea and the dry land. Then were the men exceedingly afraid, and they said unto him, Why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. So we see that the rebuke that God has brought upon Jonah. What was the rebuke that he brought? God sent a what? A great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest, so that the ship was like to be broken. We see Jonah had taken refuge in this ship, trying to escape God's presence, trying to escape to Tarshish. And the Lord said what? God sent out a wind. He was going to get Jonah's attention no matter what. No matter where Jonah tried to escape to, God had a purpose for him. We talked about this last time, I think, in the comments. Some of the feedback, or as people were thinking about the lesson a couple weeks ago about Jonah was faithful to what God wanted, whether he wanted to or not. Right? God ended up using Jonah, even though Jonah wanted to disobey. And so here we think about the idea that God has a purpose for us as believers. He loves us. He cares about us. He wants to see us achieve that purpose. And we know that when we choose to not do that purpose, what does he do? He chastens us. He corrects us. He says in Hebrews chapter 12, it says, now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them that are exercised thereby. Wherefore I lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest they which be lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. What he says, what he's reminding us in Hebrews is that God chastens us. Why? Because he cares about us. He loves us. He chastens us. He says what? He says, no chastening seemeth to be, for the present, seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Being corrected is not a fun thing. When you at work, we have an annual review, and you know the areas that you're weak in, or the things you may not have done well in. Those things you don't look forward to. When your boss says, hey, you need to work on this. Those are the things you don't look forward to. If you have to be corrected, it's not something we look forward to. But he says what? Afterwards, it yieldeth a peaceable fruit of righteousness. The idea that is that correction, that chastening, that driving back to him does what? It leads to righteousness, the peaceable fruit. The contrast there, peaceable fruit, is that the time itself is tumultuous. The time itself is stressful. But what's the result? Something peaceable. This peaceable fruit of righteousness. He says in the second half of that passage in Hebrews, what is he telling them there? He says, wherefore let the hands which hang down in the feeble knees, or lift up the hands, which hang down in the feeble knees. The idea that as we go through chastening, how should we approach those challenges, those chastening times? Humbly, right? He says, don't let your hands hang down, your knees be weak. He says, pick yourself up. He says, know that God is correcting you. I think of my kids when I correct them, and how they respond to correction is important, right? If they're okay, fine. I mean, that's the idea that he's saying here, is don't drag yourself to correction. He says, walk to it so that you can be healed. You accept that correction. As a child kind of does it rebelliously or reluctantly, we should do it acceptingly. We think of David. He said, wash me from my iniquity, for cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. He's talking about the sin that was before him, and he says what? My sin is ever before me. It's like if you imagine someone that's hiking along, and all of a sudden they come upon a mountain of their sin. The idea is that they can't cross, that mountain was one that they created, the sin that they had put upon their own life, and they're surrounded by it. You ever been in a valley and you're like, okay, where do I go now? I'm surrounded by it. Everywhere I turn, I see the cliffs in front of me. Doesn't seem like there's a way out. And that's how David felt. He says his sin was ever before thee, or before me. He says, against thee and thee only. Who's he talking to there? Who's thee? God. He says, against God and God only have I sinned in your sight, that thou mightst be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. He was acknowledged, we'll talk about this later, David was acknowledging the position that he was in. He was acknowledging the place that he was in, and the only one that could what? That could judge him, that could correct the thing that was wrong, that could take away the sin that was always in front of him. So here we have Jonah, who's in his sin, and he's facing his sin, and he's running away from it. It says, but we see the rebuke that God gave. It says, but the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea. You see, sometimes we've looked at storms before. We study the life of Christ. What was an incident where we saw a storm come? Anybody remember? Jesus got into and told the disciples to do what? Cast out and go to the other side. He sent them on a mission, right? And they went on. They're supposed to cross the Sea of Galilee. And what came? A storm came. We talked a lot about storms and how storms come up in our life. And oftentimes we don't recognize what the storm means in our life. This time for Jonah, what was the storm? Did storms come? Well, let's put it this way. Did storms come on the Mediterranean? Yeah, there were storms all the time there, right? We will look at one in a minute. Storms come up all the time, but here was a storm in Jonah's life that these seamen were facing, and what was this storm for? They knew it was something different. They knew this storm wasn't expected. What was the storm about? It was to correct him. It was for rebuke. We think in our own lives, sometimes we have storms that test us. We have storms that try our strength, that cause us to prioritize. If you're facing a hurricane, we got a tropical storm down in the Gulf right now I think it's swinging by North Carolina over land. But when we know hurricanes around here and think about hurricanes when they are coming up the coast. If we know there's a hurricane, and I tell you there's going to be a hurricane, and it's going to be crossing right over us about 12:30 today. And I told you that you're going to miss your baseball game. Do we prioritize, oh man, I was going to play baseball today? Or do you think, oh, I need to go take care of my family. I need to make sure everything is secure and safe. When storms come in our life, storms help us to focus our lives, to prioritize those things. We think about COVID and the time we've had in this past year of dealing with lockdowns and challenges and health issues and concerns. It causes you to prioritize those things in your life. It causes you to think about what's important. How do you care about your family? What are the things? How do you spend time with your family and friends differently? Those storms in our life can cause us to break or to build up. When floods happen, we don't live near the Mississippi, but when they have those floods along the river, what do? What do you see them do? The Army Corps goes down, and what do? They build up, right? They start building up the levees. They start sandbagging. They start shoring up things and making sure everything is going to withstand that storm, withstand that flood. And so we think of our own spiritual lives. When we see storms come in our life, well, how do we respond? Do we keep fleeing and just say, okay, I'm going to keep going in the direction I'm going in because that sounds about right? Or do we take kind of a inventory of our lives? Do we stop and think, where am I in my life? Do I need to build up? Or do I need to take some things down and rebuild? And you see, knowing those trials in our life are important. Turn to Acts chapter 27 real quick. There's a little bit of, we have some time, I think, in this lesson, so I'm going to take a little bit of a rabbit trail and compare this with this storm that Jonah was facing with the storm that Paul was facing. Paul had been sent by Agrippa unto Rome. And in verse 27 it says, "We determined that he should sail into Italy. They delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band." And down in verse 4 it says, "When they launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When they sailed over the sea of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia." And further down in verse 7 it says, "And we sailed slowly many days and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the winds not suffering us. We sailed under Crete over against Salome. And hardly passing it, we came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto the city of Lasea." So here we have he's describing their trip from as they're sailing across the Mediterranean. And they come to a place called Fair Havens. It's interesting, just a small little trip here, what happens, and we can imagine in our own lives. There's some times where we have a little wind and we decide to go in a different direction, and then there's some times where we're sitting in Fair Havens. And it says, and now in verse 9, it says, "Much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading of the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul." See, here we have two different contrasts. Where was Jonah supposed to be going? Was Jonah supposed to be going over the sea? No, he was supposed to be going over the land to Nineveh. And as Jonah was traveling away, where did he end up? In the bottom of the ship, asleep. Not worried about what was going on, not worried about the judgment of God upon him or the rebuke of God upon him. But here's Paul, and Paul was listening to who? Who was Paul listening to? He was listening to God, and what did he know was going to come? He knew the storm was going to come, and he said, guys, we got to watch out. This is going to be a bad trip for us. And the centurion didn't listen. He says in verse 12, because the haven was not commodious to winter, the more part advised to depart thence also, if any means they might attain to Phenice, and there to winter. And so anyways, they continued on. In verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their purpose, loosing Crete, they sailed close by Crete. You see, the centurion and the shipmaster looked around, and they said, you know what? The winds look good. Let's go. But who were they listening to? They weren't listening to God. It says, and not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euryclidian. And the ship was caught and could not bear into the wind. We let her drive, and running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. And when they had taken it up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day they cast out their own hands the tackling of the ship. And neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us. All hope that we should be saved was taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and should not have loosed from Crete, and have gained the harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. For there shall no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this day, this night, the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given him all that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall even be as it is told unto me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. And he goes on, and we know the story that they end up shipwrecked. And all the men survive. He tells them to go eat so that they can swim ashore. And they eat and have a meal and they swim ashore. And so further down look in verse 28 or chapter 28. It says, when they were escaped, they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us, every one, because of the present rain and because of the cold. And Paul goes and gathers some sticks and look down, and he gets bitten by a serpent, and he shakes it off. And they thought of him as a god in verse 6. And down in verse 7, in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever of a bloody flux. And Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands upon him and healed him. And when it was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. You see, it's interesting to me when you think of Paul and Paul's trip here. Paul knew that there was going to be a storm. How did Paul know that there was going to be a storm? Who was he listening to? He listened to God. The angel told him, right? He was paying attention to what God had told him. God told him you were going to face trials. But what happened because of that trip? You're like, I don't think much happened. He ended up going to Rome still, didn't he? But what happened in there after they landed on that ship, or landed on the island? Who got healed? The chief's father got healed. We also see that people got healed. We see that Paul was able to be a minister into a place that they wouldn't have happened. And so God used Paul no matter what the situation was in. So here we have Jonah, and the idea that Jonah was fleeing from God, but God did what? God still used him. Look at what happened. He says, we know that the other people on the ship, they did what? They worshiped their gods first and and we'll talk about that in a minute. They worshiped their gods first, and they were exceedingly afraid. And after we look down further, and it says, we know that they worshipped God at the end of this. In verse 16 of chapter 1, it says, and the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord and made vows. After Jonah is cast into the sea and the fish swallow him, we see that the men worship God. So here in Jonah, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of Jonah's rebellion, God's rebuke still leads to what? His purpose. No matter what we do, God's purpose is in control. We see first that we have an omnipotent creator. It says, but the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea. We know that we know that he is the one that sent the wind. We know that he's the one that created all things. The physical things that happen in our world, that he's the one that's in control. He put those things in motion. And he says, Revelation chapter 4:11, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Psalms 119, thy faithfulness is unto all generations. Thou hast established the earth, and it abideth. They continue this day according to thy ordinances, for all are thy servants. We know the book of Jonah. We talked about Jonah being referenced by Christ. We know that it's a true book. It's not this wasn't just a storm that was made up, and we'll talk about the fish later in the next lesson. But we know that this wasn't just a storm that was made up. That this was Christ referenced this. We know that this book has been referenced in other places by other scholars. We know that what God sent that storm, He sent it because He is in control. We know that He is the omnipotent creator. Even we talked about the crossing of the Sea of Galilee when he says, peace be still, and He calms the winds. What was His disciples' reaction? What manner of man is this, that the winds and sea obey Him? In Matthew chapter 8. And in Jonah chapter 1, we know He's omnipotent because look at all the things He controls through Jonah. We talked about a little bit this in the intro lesson. It says, but God sent out what? A great wind. And then what did God prepare? A great fish. And then what did God prepare? A gourd. And then lastly, what did He prepare? A worm. We see it's interesting. You think of all the things that God prepared. It's all different aspects of nature, isn't it? The winds, the weather, the animals, the fish, the gourd, the plants, the insects, and the worm. We see that God has control over it all, as we see through Jonah. Jonah couldn't go anywhere where God wasn't in control. He couldn't even sit under a gourd where God wasn't in control. God was in control through Jonah's entire journey. We also see that there's overpowering circumstances. And in 1 Samuel chapter 2, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is any rock like our God. Talk no more so exceedingly proud. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. We see the circumstances that surrounded this. God was in control. God had a purpose for Jonah and was going to carry Jonah through that purpose. No matter what Jonah did. What was Jonah's purpose? What was his purpose at this point? Flee from the presence of God. And we think how foolish that sounds, but he thought he could flee from the presence of God. That's what Samuel's talking about here. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by Him are actions weighed. We see in Job chapter 9, it says, who hath hardened himself against Him and hath prospered? He's talking about those that have tried to resist God. Can we fight against God? I mean, Isaiah says, woe unto him that striveth with his master. Sometimes we try to argue with God, try to reason with God. Well, that's. I know you want me to go to Nineveh, but that's a really bad place, Lord. You really don't want me going there. So much so that Jonah said, "What? I'm just going to go to sleep. God, you don't really need me. You can find someone else." And we know later on in this passage, what does he even try to do? He tries to get the sailors to throw him into the sea and commit suicide. He says, "Get rid of me completely." He's trying to argue with God when God had a purpose for his life. But we know that God is more powerful than those circumstances. We see the breaking of the ship. Jonah chapter 1 and verse 4. It says, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that what? The ship was like to be broken. What did the ship represent to the sailors? I'm not in the Navy. I just saw Brother Chappell. What does a ship represent to the sailors? The source of work. How would you like to cross the sea without a ship? It's safety. The ship is safe, right? You don't want to go in the sea without the ship. You need the ship, right? That's the only way you get across. The idea that the ship was their safety. It was their refuge. Why is it that we say the captain goes down with the ship? Because he's the last man. That means it's the worst situation. We see that man's refuge is what? Vulnerable. Jonah thought, I will get in a ship Jonah didn't try to sail the ship himself, did he? No, Jonah wasn't that ignorant. He knew that he was going to find he found some folks that knew what they were doing. He thought the skills of the mariners and the ship that they sailed was going to get him across to Tarshish. But what was his refuge? His refuge wasn't enough. In verse 4 we saw it says, so that the ship was like to be broken, that the mariners were afraid and cried every man unto his God and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. When we think of our own refuge, Jonah was sleeping in that refuge. But was that a safe refuge? What was happening? What were the sailors doing? They were crying unto their own gods. They cast forth all the wares, everything that they were sailing across the sea for. They threw it into the sea to hopefully keep the ship afloat. We think of our own refuge and the things that we bring that we carry, that we think will carry us in our lives. What are some of those refuges that we think will carry us in our lives? About money, about jobs, about family, those refuges that we rely on, and we think, oh, they're always going to be there, they're always going to take care of us. And then when the storm comes, what happens? We cry out. We try to lighten our load. Oh, maybe I just need to do less things. Maybe I need to try this and try that. The refuge in our life is vulnerable. We see in Titus chapter 3, verse 5 and 6 says, not by the works of righteousness what we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Ghost, which he shed on us abundantly through the Lord Jesus Christ our Savior. It's not our own righteousness. A lot of times we think good works, that'll get us, that'll lighten our load. If we do good things, it makes us feel good, right? Does that lighten our load of sin? Or lighten our burden of sin? No. It's only through his righteousness, only through the washing and regeneration and renewing of the Holy Ghost. We see man's refuge is vulnerable. We also know that God is greater than our ways, that we try to do things that try to satisfy or try to keep us safe. He says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are the ways and your ways, and my thoughts and your thoughts. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. We think of our own ways. When we think we can think better than God, what's he tell us here? My thoughts and my ways are far higher than you. He says, as much as I may think I'm a really smart person and I may have read all the great leadership books or the great self-help books and try to fix my life or try to go in a way that I think I should be going, what's he say? My ways are better than your ways. We need to turn to what God says and follow what God says. He's the one that's going to his way is not going to end in destruction, but ours will. We see man's resolve is what? Vain. It says, and the mariners were afraid and cried every man unto his God and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten to them. What was their first reaction? Where did they turn to? Their religion. They returned to their first thing they looked to was their religion. They cried every man into his God and cast forth the wares that were in the ship. They turned to their religion and their possessions to try to solve the problem. Romans chapter 10 says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about it, establisheth their own righteousness, having not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. He's talking about Israel there, and he says, what? My heart's desire that Israel might be saved. But what's the problem? He says they have a zeal. And that zeal is, maybe it could be a good thing, but that zeal, they have a zeal of God, but not what? According to knowledge. It's according to their own works. It says, for they being ignorant of God's righteousness went about to establish their own righteousness and not submitting themselves to the righteousness of God. We as believers, as Christians, can easily fall into this. We lean upon our own righteousness, our own good works, our own things to try to appease God. We can even have a zeal about it, right? They said here, Israel has a zeal of God. But what are they lacking? Submission to his righteousness. Submission to what God wants. See, man's resolve is vain. We know Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy path. Jonah thought he knew a better way. Jonah thought he could choose a path that could be without God. But God wasn't going to let him do it. God knew a better, God's paths. Jonah was going to have to acknowledge God in his path. We see here that the burden of sin, not the last part, but almost there, the burden of sin. We see that sin that puts a burden upon us. Matthew chapter 11, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest to your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We know that sin puts a burden on us. We know that the way of the transgressor, it says in Proverbs chapter 13, the way of transgressors is hard. Why has sin put a burden on us? What burden does sin put upon us? It separates us from the fellowship. Yep. We're isolated, right? It isolates us from him. What else does it do? What else does it do? Does sin impact our lives? If we're separated from God, we're walking contrary to him, what's going to happen in our lives? Is it going to impact our lives? Yeah, what did we just read? There's a way that seems right unto a man, but the end is what? It's death. He's talking about sin. The way of sin it seems right. The way of sin feels like it's the right way, but it's going to end in death. The burden of sin, he says, but the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked. There's time. We think of this world that we're in and the turmoil and the strife and the drama, if you want to call it that happens constantly. In a world of sin, there's constant turmoil. There's constant, that's what he says, it's like the sea that's troubled, they cannot rest, whose water cast up mire and dirt. You ever been to or seen the beaches when the water's calm and it's nice and clear? And you ever go back and see it when a storm happens or it just happened? What's the water look like? Murky and dark, churned up. And that's the idea. That's what our world looks like when we think of when we have the wicked, or when that wickedness. It's just churned up and it's cloudy. It's hard to see. It's hard to pass through. It says, there is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked. There's a burden in sin. We see that Jonah was in sin and he was carrying that burden. And that burden caused him to lead to careless indifference. Where did Jonah end up? He was fast asleep in the sides of the ship. Jonah said, I just don't even care anymore. I don't even care what the Lord, I'm just going to get as far away as I can and not care. It says, Pastor mentioned this verse last week, Isaiah chapter 59. It says, we grope for the wall like the blind, and we grope as if we had no eyes. We stumble at noonday as in the night. We are in a desolate place as dead men. He's talking about this idea of just being indifferent, not knowing the difference between right and wrong, not knowing where we should go, in what direction, and just giving up. Ephesians chapter 4, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. We pile sin upon sin and we live in sin and we continue to turn away from God. What's going to happen to our hearts? We become darkened. If I wander farther away from the light, I wander further into the dark. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. This isn't just for the unbeliever, but how we walk our spiritual lives matters as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. It says, "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. I fed you with milk, and not with meat. For hitherto you were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able. For ye are yet carnal, for whereas there is among you envying and strives and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men?" So Paul was reminding the Corinthians they were having strife and division among themselves, and they were so concerned about the stuff that was going on around them. They were what? They were forgetting their spiritual need. He says, "I can only feed you with milk and not with meat because you weren't able to bear it." It says believers, we've got to be careful that we think of the world and it's easy to say, oh, they're so far gone. They're so just lost in their sin. Their heart's blind. But as believers, we can be so carnal. We can be so focused on the things around us, on again, I kind of say the drama or the strife and the division that happens around us, that what happens? We can't even handle the spiritual things, the spirit that we should be able to handle. He says you should be able to eat meat, and I'm only able to give you that milk of the word. I'm only able to give you the do's and the don'ts, the yeses and the no's. This is the clear direction. You're not able to handle those things that are more that are tougher and that you got to chew and meditate on. We see that the burden of sin also is costly. So the shipmaster came unto him. So first off, we know what happened with the ship, with the sailors. What did they lose in their travels because of Jonah's sin? All their wares, their life. I mean, we think of the impact. What was happening? These guys had families probably. They were sailors. They had families. They did this for a living. Now all their wares were gone. Who was that going to impact? All their families. All their families have lost all their, their revenue for that trip were gone. And now they were fearing for their lives. Jonah's sin had put the sailors' lives at risk. Jonah chapter 1 and verse 6 says, "So the shipmaster came unto him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not." You see, our sin has impacts on others. Our sin impacts others in that as Romans chapter 14 says, for none of us liveth unto himself, and no man dieth to himself. And in that Romans chapter 14, he's talking about eating of meats or not eating of meats. And the idea that as any believer, when we sin, our sin is not what? There's no such thing as a victimless sin. Because what happens to sin in our lives? It impacts those around us. First, who does it impact? Ourselves, as we've said. It impacts our relationship with God. But what else does it impact? It impacts our relationship with others. If I'm living a life that is not true, that is not honest, and we'll look at this in a minute, and if I'm living a life of deceit or a life of wickedness, what's going to happen to my heart? It's going to corrupt my heart. We know that out of the heart come the issues of life. And as Romans 14 says, no man liveth unto himself, and no man dieth unto himself. We've heard the thing of it's a victimless crime. Oh, well, if I do this, or I do this drug, or I do whatever, it's a victimless crime. It doesn't hurt anybody. But it does. Each of those decisions hurts someone. It impacts their life. And so as believers, we've got to realize that our sin is costly. We also see that we've got to be careful of the belittling of the sacred. I know this is a long passage, but the author puts this in here, and I think it's a worthwhile one to look at. He says in 1 Peter chapter 2, and verse 9, he says, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." So he's talking there to believers. He's saying that you have been chosen, that you should be showing forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but now are a people of God, which had not attained mercy, but now have attained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. It's interesting. I've read that passage a lot because verse 2 is one of my favorite passages when I think of what it means to live the Christian life, because he says there to show forth the praises of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. The idea that as a believer, our life should be defined by what? By praise, by gratitude, by thankfulness of what God has done in our life. But it's interesting, as you read on, that passage is tied together. He says, look, he's reminding them. He says, but you're a chosen generation. You're special. God has chosen you. God has redeemed you. And he says what? But dearly beloved. This is where he goes, he's basically saying heart to heart. Let me tell you this. This is where my care is for you. I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles. He says, you know what? Your life should be defined by praise, but you're falling into things that shouldn't be, that shouldn't define your life. Because what's going to happen? It says that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of salvation. That as believers, we should be careful to what? Belittle the sacred. What was Jonah given? What was Jonah given at the very beginning of Jonah? A command. He was given a command of God. It says what in verse 1? Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah. Imagine if you were given the word of the Lord. I mean, we have the Bible, but imagine in Jonah's time if God said, hey, Rob, I need you to go do this specific thing for me. That's pretty powerful. He talks about there later on in verse 9, he says, I am a Hebrew and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which made the land and the sea and the dry land. He understood who God was. And he had something sacred. He had a message that he had to take to Nineveh. But instead, what did he do with it? He tossed it like it was just nothing. And he ran from it as far as he could. We see that in the belittling of the sacred, we've got to be careful not to belittle the sacred. He says, ye are our epistle. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3 again, 2 Corinthians, sorry. Ye are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart. This is a reminder. It's an interesting passage when you read it. Think about this. He's saying, we know the Word of God is here, right? We know what the epistles are. What's an epistle? It's a letter, right? This is a letter. We have letters from Paul that we call that are letters to the church. And we know that the Bible is a letter to us. Someone has called it a love letter to the world. He says what? Ye are our what? Ye are our letter, written in your hearts, known and read of all men, for as much as ye are manifestly declared to be what? The letter of Christ, ministered by us. The idea that our message, that we as believers are what to the world? We are God's letter to the world. And how we carry ourselves and how we live our lives is what? He says what? Not written with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but with fleshly tables of the heart. The idea is believers, our lives should be what? Defined by who God is. We've heard it said before, if we were to be put on trial as a Christian, would you be convicted? It's that idea that if someone read that letter that your life tells of God, how would you describe God based on your life? Based on your decisions, based on how you approach him, how you think of him. We think of letters, and our anniversary is tomorrow, and it reminded me I need to do better at letter writing, because I know when we first were dating, that was something I used to do, is we'd write letters all the time. And why do we write letters to someone we love? We express our heart. We express our concern. We express more than just sometimes we say in person, because it's awkward to get flowery when you're talking to somebody. But you can do that in a letter. And that's the idea is as a believer, when we express our heart, what if we were to express your heart right now, what would it describe? Would it be a letter of Christ? Would it tell about Christ's love, or would it tell about the things that I'm interested in or the things I'm concerned about? Would it tell about how God has worked in my life or about how I've tried to fix the things in my life? In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 says, give no offense in anything that what? The ministry be not blamed. As believers, we have a responsibility to carry the sacred, to carry God's message to the world. We see Jonah's confession towards the, as I just read in verse 9, Jonah starts to get honest. He had been sleeping and the shipmaster came and woke him. And I will mention that one of our classmates mentioned a few weeks ago that this passage in verse 7 does not condone gambling, because if in this sense that if you know that the lots are going to cast on Jonah, then this is not it's not to condone any gambling in this, but the idea that they cast lots and it landed on Jonah. Even God was in control of the lots that were being cast. I think it's interesting. And he said unto them, tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us. What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? Whence is thy country, and thy people art thou? And this is where Jonah confesses and says, I am a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which made the sea and the dry land. Jonah begins to be honest with who he is and with who he should be. Now we know that Jonah still doesn't want to go, is still avoiding the presence of the Lord, because he says that in verse 10, for the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. We know that we have our first step towards a turning to repentance and turning towards God is what? Honesty. Becoming real with what our sin is in our life. Proverbs chapter 16 says, by mercy and truth, iniquity is purged. It's interesting. When we think of that passage, when we think of mercy and truth, where does mercy come from? From God. By truth. By understanding our sin and what our sin means in our lives. By the mercy of God and the truth of God. That's the law. The idea that the law is the measure of our sin. By mercy and truth, iniquity is purged. Hebrews chapter 4, neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open into the eyes of him with whom we have to do. The idea that we can't hide anything from him, so why do we try? God knows everything. And so for the first step in to acknowledging our sin and repenting of our sin is being honest with our sin and in our current state. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, our lives should be defined by honesty. It says, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We've said this before, as believers, how should my life be defined? As a believer, should my life be defined as deceit, conspiracy, paranoia? No, our lives should be defined by honest things, by truth, by reality. If the world has enough things to be skeptical about, why do we add something else in our own lives? Why do we make people not trust Christ if we're going to add to that dishonesty? Hebrews chapter 13, pray for us, for we trust we have a good conscience in all things, willing to live honestly. That's where he says we want to try to live honestly in all aspects of our life as a believer. We see that there's a confusion here at the end. He says, then they were exceedingly afraid and said unto him, why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. You see, this is where the sailors who had cried out to their own gods, who had done everything they could in their own lives to try to, or in this trip to try to save their own lives, they realized when Jonah said, I know I'm a servant of God, the ruler of heaven, the creator of heaven and earth. What did they say? Why hast thou done this? Why hast thou done this? The idea that they were confused. They were confused by why someone who understood who God was would make a decision that would put others' lives at risk. You see, we need to be careful with our lives that we don't give, as in 2 Samuel, it says, given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. It's not just the words we say. It's not just the things that we talk about or the things that we try to portray ourselves, or what we put on social media and say, well, look, I put a Bible verse up every day. I must be a good Christian. It's about every aspect of our life. He says, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. This is Paul talking to the Romans. This is what the Gentiles are blaspheming because of you, because of the way you're living your life. Are we, and he's talking to a church. He's not talking to the world. He's talking to believers. So as believers, when we think of Jonah's life, we think of where Jonah was and what he tried to do in getting away. It's a caution to us to think about the impact that our lives have. I'll leave you with this passage because I think when I studied this lesson, this verse kept coming up. And I kept thinking of if Jonah was the church, you can call it the American church, the church in the world today, the church that we feel needs a revival. Imagine if this was the shipmaster talking to the church. So the shipmaster came into him and said unto him, "What meanest thou, O sleeper?" Are we a church that's asleep down in the bottom of the ship, waiting for God to take care of stuff? Waiting for God to get it right? Or are we ready and ready to turn around, ready to repent? He says, "Arise and call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not." This is the cry of the world. What's the cry of the world? He says what? "Arise and call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not." You want to talk about a missions message? That passage right there leaves it. Are we arising and calling upon our God so that God will think upon this world and they don't perish? What was Jonah's call? To go, to witness, to call for repentance. As believers, we have a call upon our life. Let's not be found sleeping in the side of the ship. Any thoughts? Prayer before any comments before we close up? All right, let's close in a word of prayer. We'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together, Lord. We thank you for this reminder of the example that Jonah has given us, Lord, and the warning of Jonah's life. Lord, help us not to be so indifferent, so caught up in our own sin, our own solutions, Lord, that we neglect the call that you've given us. Help us to be active in that call every day, Lord. Help us to be reaching the world around us, reaching our Jerusalem and our Judea, Lord, and beyond. And I pray you just help us to be that testimony, Lord, no matter what. Help us to be people of honesty and truth, people that live lives that honor you, that speak of you, Lord. Lord, I pray you just help us to bring revival, Lord. Bring revival upon our lives and upon the world around us. We thank you for this time together, and we thank you for the message ahead. Help our hearts be prepared and ready for what you'd have for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.